His eyes opened to the scent of herbs and smoke. Raw, unfamiliar, nothing like the perfumed world he came from. For one fragile second, the billionaire prince thought he was dead, until he saw her. A poor maid's daughter, hands trembling from exhaustion, staring at him with the relief of someone who had wrestled death and won. She had dragged him out of the bush, the same bush where wild animals circled his bleeding body only hours before. She had torn her own shawl to stop his wound, whispered prayers over him while the storm raged, and carried him barefoot through the mud. But when the prince finally spoke, he laughed, and with a single mocking sentence, he shattered the girl who had given him life. If only he knew that fate was already preparing a cruel repayment. Prince Kalen had always believed the world would bend before him, but the world has a cruel way of reminding a man of his size. It began with a shiver in the earth, so faint that even the guards dismissed it. Yet Kalen felt it, just for a moment, a tremor under the tires, a warning carried through metal and bone. Then came the roar, a grinding, rising thunder that swallowed their voices as the mountainside tore free and crashed toward the convoy. The driver shouted something sharp and panicked. Kalen barely heard it. The world flipped, metal screamed, and the prince who thought nothing could touch him was thrown into the wild like a forgotten coin. He hit the ground hard. The air punched out of his lungs, leaving him staring at a canopy of violent gray clouds swirling overhead. Rain stung his face, cold and insistent. Somewhere behind him, the mangled remains of the vehicle smoked, but the forest swallowed the sound of the other cars. He called out, but his voice died in the wind. No answer, no footsteps, just the hiss of rain and a distant howl rolling through the trees. He tried to stand, only to feel something hot and wet sliding down his side. His hand came away red. The sight shocked him, not because he feared blood, but because it was his. For the first time in years, he whispered, "Someone. Help." The woods didn't care who he was. His title meant nothing here. His wealth meant even less. And when his legs finally gave out, the prince fell to his knees, clutching his ribs as darkness pushed in around the edges of his vision. He staggered forward anyway, determined not to die in a place that didn't even know his name. Each step felt heavier than the last. Each breath rasped like sandpaper. The bushlands grew darker, thicker, as if the forest leaned closer to watch him fail. Shadows moved where no shadows should, and glowing eyes blinked from between the trees. Kalen turned slowly, heart pounding. Predators circled, curious, patient. A lion would have been mercy. These were scavengers, waiting for him to fall. "Back away," he croaked, raising a shaking arm as if authority alone could command nature. But authority meant nothing to hunger. When he finally collapsed, his cheek pressed into wet soil. Rain pooled around his fingers. His breathing became shallow, ragged. He wondered if anyone would even find his body. Would the headlines mourn him? Or would they simply rehearse his wealth, his arrogance, the empire he inherited but never earned? The storm rumbled, his vision blurred, and then a light, soft, flickering, too warm to belong to a creature prowling the night. Footsteps approached, light, cautious, human. A shadow bent over him. "Prince Kalen," a girl whispered, as if unsure if royalty could bleed like this. He tried to lift his head. She wasn't a guard. Her clothes were patched. Her hands smelled of crushed leaves and earth. She looked young, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who'd learned to survive without expecting rescue. She placed a hand on his forehead and flinched at the heat. "You'll die out here," she murmured. Anyone would. He didn't recognize her, and that alone frightened him more than the wound. Everyone he met knew him first, bowed first, spoke last. But this girl, she looked at him like he was just a broken man lying in the mud. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a hoarse, "Don't touch me." She almost stepped back. Almost. But something in his voice, panic, not command, made her stay. She slid her arms beneath him, grunting under his weight. She was smaller than he expected, yet somehow stronger than anyone had ever dared to be around him. When he slipped in and out of consciousness, he heard her whispering to herself, "Come on, just a little further. Don't let him die." It confused him. Why would she care? The forest stretched endlessly. Mud tried to swallow their footsteps. The wind sliced through her thin clothing, but she didn't stop. When Kalen fell limp, she dragged him. When he groaned, she repositioned him gently. When thunder cracked above them, she shielded his head with her own shawl, now soaked and torn. An hour passed, maybe 2. Time meant nothing inside pain. Finally, she pushed open the door of a small wooden shelter hidden beneath tangled branches, a place built not for comfort but survival. She laid him on a mat of woven reeds, breathing hard, arms trembling violently from effort. He felt her press cloth to his wound, felt the sting of herbs ground fresh beneath her fingers, felt the warmth of a fire she coaxed to life as his body shook with fever. Her voice drifted in and out, humming something soft, something that didn't belong to royalty or wealth, but to people who healed because no one else would. When the fever spiked, he whispered, "Why? Why help me?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she wrung water from a cloth and placed it on his brow. "Because if I walk past a dying man and pretend not to see him, I become what the world has become to us." Her meaning blurred in his ears, but the softness of her tone lingered. He tried to hold on to consciousness, tried to fight the heaviness pulling him under. But exhaustion swallowed him whole, and the last thing he saw was her silhouette bending over him, determined, gentle, and impossibly brave. Outside, the storm settled into a steady drizzle. Inside, the fire crackled softly, keeping death at arm's length for one more night. And as dawn crept slowly across the sky, Prince Kalen lay breathing in the shelter of a girl he never imagined would carry his fate on her shoulders. The sun rose. His eyes opened, and the first words he would speak to the girl who saved him would reveal just how dark his heart truly was. Morning slipped quietly into the hut, a pale beam of sunlight crawling across the dirt floor until it reached Kalen's face. The warmth made him stir, but it was the soft rustle of fabric nearby that pulled him fully awake. His eyes snapped open with the sharp instinct of a man used to danger, and for a brief, fragile second, he looked afraid. Then he saw her. Leora knelt beside the fire, her back turned, stirring a bowl of crushed herbs. Her clothes were dried but still stained with mud, torn at the hem, clinging to her skin from the night's rain. Her hair, tangled and heavy, framed a face marked by exhaustion. To Kalen, waking in unfamiliar surroundings with unfamiliar company, she looked less like a savior and more like a stranger who had taken advantage of a vulnerable prince. He pushed himself upright too quickly, a jolt of pain cutting across his ribs. Leora turned, startled, the bowl nearly slipping from her hands. "Careful," she said gently. "You're still bleeding inside. You shouldn't sit." "Who are you?" he snapped, voice sharp, brittle with mistrust. "What are you doing here?" She blinked, confused. "I'm helping you. You were hurt. I found you in the bush last night." Kalen's gaze raked over her from head to toe. The patched skirt, the frayed sleeves, the bare feet still marked with dried mud. He scoffed. "You? You expect me to believe you saved me?" A flicker of hurt crossed her face, but she steadied her voice. "You were unconscious. There was no one else. I did what I—" He interrupted with a laugh, cold and disbelieving. "A bush girl dragging a prince through the wilderness? Don't insult me?" His words landed like stones, heavy and careless. Leora lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening around the bowl as if it were the only thing holding her together. "You can check the trail yourself," she murmured. "The blood. It's all there. You lost a lot." But Kalen wasn't listening. He was too busy picking apart the details that offended him. The dirt on her arms, the cracked skin on her hands, the countryside accent she had tried so hard to soften. "What were you doing out there anyway?" he said. "Waiting for someone rich to collapse so you could claim a reward?" Her breath caught. "No, I was gathering medicine. My mother works." "Spare me the stories," he muttered, waving a hand dismissively. "People like you always have some hardship to sell." That line broke something inside her. She had stayed awake all night tending his wound, feeding the fire, whispering prayers to keep him breathing. She had risked predators, storms, and the wrath of her own village for bringing home a stranger. And now he looked at her like she was dirt on his shoe. "I don't want anything from you," she whispered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed the wound he couldn't see. "I only wanted you to live." Kaelin leaned back as if offended by her sincerity. "Well, congratulations. You've done your good deed. Now step aside." He swung his legs off the mat, ignoring the stabbing pain, ignoring the dizziness, ignoring everything except the need to reassert the superiority he believed was his birthright. Leora reached out instinctively to steady him, but he recoiled. "Don't touch me." Her hand hovered in the air before slowly dropping to her side. He didn't look at her. He was too busy brushing the dust from his clothes, trying to reclaim the image of a man who had never needed saving. Outside, distant voices began calling his name. Guards, the search party. Leora's posture stiffened, relief and dread twisting together. She knew what came next. She had seen nobles before. She had cleaned their halls, served their meals, learned their rules. She knew her place in their eyes. The door burst open, and 3 guards rushed in, rain-soaked and frantic. "Your Highness," one gasped. "We found you. Thank God we found you." Kaelin's shoulders straightened, arrogance sliding back into him like a familiar coat. "About time," he said, ignoring the shock on their faces when they saw his condition. One guard knelt beside him. "Who treated your wound? It's packed with herbs. This is advanced field work." Kaelin hesitated only a moment before pointing at Leora with a shrug. "She attempted something." Then he added, under his breath, "Bush remedies." The guard began thanking her anyway, but Kaelin cut him off. "We're done here. Let's go." He stepped toward the exit, swaying slightly. Leora instinctively moved forward, thinking he might fall again. Instead, he turned and delivered the cruelest blow yet. "You can stay in your hut," he said flatly. "Your job here is finished." Leora felt the words land like a slap. She lowered her gaze not because she accepted them, but because pride burned too sharply in her chest to let him see her cry. Kaelin stepped out into the daylight without looking back. The guards surrounded him instantly, guiding him toward the waiting convoy. One asked whether they should compensate the girl or bring her to the palace for further questions. Kaelin didn't even break stride. "Leave her. She's no one." Those 3 words, simple, careless, final, sank into her like a blade. She stood motionless in the doorway as the engines roared to life. Dust rose behind the convoy, curling into the air, erasing their tracks as if the prince had never been there. As if she had never carried him across the stormy bush. As if her hands had never held his bleeding skin, or her whispered prayers had never kept him alive. When the dust finally settled, Leora's shoulders curved inward, the weight of the night and the insult folding her spirit in half. She knelt beside the cooling fire, staring at the herbs she had crushed, the cloth she had torn from her only shawl, the bloodstains drying on the floor. None of it mattered now. Not to him, not to the world he came from. But as she cleaned the remnants of her kindness, something strange stirred in the distance. Voices, whispers, a ripple of curiosity. The guards hadn't left quietly. They had spoken to the villagers. They had marveled at the girl who kept the prince alive. And rumors, like seeds scattered by the wind, had begun to take root. Leora didn't know it yet. Kaelin didn't either. But the very mockery that broke her was the first spark pulling their worlds back together. The palace should have felt like safety, yet Kalen had never felt more trapped. His body healed faster than his mind, and by the second morning, he was pacing his chambers as if the walls themselves whispered the memory he was trying to bury. Every step reminded him of the mud under his knees, the cold mouth of fear, and the girl whose face he could barely recall, except for the way her eyes dimmed when he mocked her. He told himself it didn't matter. She was a stranger, a nobody. But the thought refused to die quietly. A pair of medics entered to check his bandages, murmuring to each other as they peeled back the cloth. One of them paused. "Remarkable work," he said softly. The field treatment kept the infection down. Kalen frowned. "What treatment?" The medic hesitated before answering. "Herbal packing, pressure binding. Whoever treated you knew what they were doing. Saved your life, Your Highness." He wanted to brush the comment aside, but something in the medic's tone made him look up. "Guard said a girl found me," he said. "What did she actually do?" The second medic exchanged a glance with the first. Then he spoke carefully, as though the truth might insult the prince. "She carried you for nearly an hour through the storm, alone. Your clothing was torn from hyena tracks. She must have scared them off or worked around them. And your fever. She stayed awake all night, pressing a warm cloth to your wound to keep your blood flowing." Kalen's breath stilled. He tried to imagine it, this frail girl dragging him through freezing mud, fighting off the darkness he'd surrendered to. But the image didn't match the insult he'd thrown at her. He remembered her hands trembling. He assumed it was fear, but now he wondered if it was exhaustion. "What was her name?" he asked before he could stop himself. "Leora," the medic replied, almost surprised. "Her mother cleans the lower palace corridors. They're from the outskirts." A maid's daughter, a servant's child, someone who'd grown up unseen by nobles like him. His throat tightened, a quiet sting blooming beneath his ribs. He dismissed the medics with a quick nod, but the echo of that name followed him long after they left. Leora. He whispered it once, testing the weight of it, feeling a strange heaviness press against his chest. He saw again the way she flinched when he pushed her hand away, the way her shoulders sank when he called her a thief. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, shame settling in like a slow, cold tide. Meanwhile, miles away, Leora moved silently through her village, trying to lose herself in routine. She washed the herbs from her skirts and scrubbed the blood from her fingers. But even as she ground berries for dyes and folded laundry beside her mother, her mind kept replaying his voice. "A bush girl saving a prince?" The words clung to her like the mud she'd carried him through. Her mother noticed the way her smile faltered. "Leora," she said gently, "what happened out there?" "Nothing," she answered quickly. Too quickly. Just a man who needed help. But the lie tasted bitter. Her mother placed a hand on her cheek. "Kindness doesn't always earn kindness in return." Leora nodded, yet the bruise on her heart remained. Life tried to move forward, but fate, stubborn and patient, waited for the moment to tighten its grip. It came 3 nights later. Leora woke to find her mother shivering violently, breath shallow, skin burning. A fever, one too strong for their village remedies. Panic stole her air. "No, Mama, stay with me." She tried every herb she knew, but her mother's condition worsened. At dawn, Leora made a decision she never imagined she'd face again. She wrapped her mother in a blanket, hitched a small cart to the village mule, and began the long journey toward the palace, the very place she vowed never to return. Every turn of the wheels grated at her memory. The road Kalen had traveled, the bush she'd dragged him through, the hut filled with humiliation. By the time she reached the palace gates, her legs were numb. The guards recognized her instantly, though their expressions were gentler now, touched by the rumors of what she'd done. One guard hurried her inside. "Your mother needs the infirmary," he urged. "We'll take her." Leora followed close, heart pounding, praying the fever had not already stolen too much time. Kalen happened to be crossing the upper corridor when he heard the commotion below. He paused at the railing, looking down. A group of guards hurried through the courtyard with a stretcher, and beside them, he saw her. He froze. She looked different in daylight, not covered in mud or rain, but still carrying the exhaustion of someone who had fought too many battles alone. Her hair clung to her temples, her clothes were faded, and worry carved deep lines into her expression. Yet there was something steady in the way she moved, something unbroken despite everything. His breath wavered. Guilt twisted, sharp and unrelenting. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. It felt wrong somehow, watching her from above when she had once watched over him from inches away. One of the guards spoke to her, and Kalen leaned forward instinctively, trying to catch her voice. He heard fragments. Fever. Medicine. Please, she's all I have. He saw her hands shaking as she clutched her mother's blanket. A sickening realization hit him. She wasn't here because of him. She wasn't here to seek repayment, recognition, or apology. She was here because she was losing someone she loved. And suddenly the memory of pushing her hand away burned through his mind. He stepped back from the railing, unsure what he was supposed to do. A prince wasn't trained for this, for remorse, for humility, for confronting the harm he caused. He pressed a hand against the cold marble wall, grounding himself. He whispered her name again, softer this time. Leora. Down below, she disappeared into the infirmary, leaving Kalen standing alone in the hallway, caught between the man he had been and the man he wasn't sure he could become. And for the first time since the accident, he felt the world shifting under his feet, pulling him toward a truth he could no longer ignore. The forced reunion he'd been avoiding was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. Kalen hadn't expected to see her again so soon, and certainly not like this. One moment he was moving through the palace corridor trying to look composed despite the weight in his chest, and the next, there she was. Leora stood just inside the infirmary doorway, clutching a folded slip of medical notes, her mother lying pale and trembling on a narrow bed behind her. Her eyes lifted toward him, and for a heartbeat, everything stilled. The corridor, the guards, even Kalen's breath. He opened his mouth, but shame locked the words in his throat. How could he approach her now? How could he form an apology worthy of the night she saved him? He barely managed a whisper. Leora. Her face tightened, not in anger, but in a quiet ache that made him want to look away. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence told him everything he had ruined. Before he could try again, a sharp, violent crack split the air. Electric, metallic, wrong. The lights above them flickered. A second later, a scream erupted from the far hallway, followed by a roar that made the floor tremble. Smoke burst through the stairwell vents like a living creature. Someone shouted, "Fire in the West Wing! Evacuate the staff quarters!" Panic rippled through the palace. Nobles rushed for the exits, hands over their mouths, while guards scrambled to understand the source. Kalen's pulse spiked. The West Wing. That was where the laundry chambers were located. That was where Leora's mother worked. Leora didn't wait for instructions. She didn't wait for permission. The moment she understood, she ran. She bolted past the guards, past Kalen, past the warnings echoing behind her. Her braid whipped over her shoulder as she sprinted toward the flames without a second thought. Kalen reacted before reason caught up with him. "Leora!" he shouted, chasing her down the corridor. A guard grabbed his arm, yelling something about protocol, but Kalen jerked free with a force none of them expected. "Move," he snapped. "She won't survive alone." Heat struck them before they even reached the wing. It pushed outward like a furnace, inhaling the entire corridor. Smoke bled through the cracks in the door, thick enough to sting the eyes. Leora threw her weight against the handle, and Kalen rushed beside her. Together they shoved it open, and a wall of burning air swallowed them whole. Inside, flames crawled up the walls, licking at wooden beams that groaned and buckled overhead. Laundry carts burned in heaps. Sparks rained from shattered light fixtures. Through the haze, Leora heard someone coughing. Weak, frantic. She sprinted toward the sound. Kalen followed, arm shielding his face, lungs already fighting the smoke. "Leora, slow down," he choked out, but she didn't. She couldn't. Her mother was somewhere in that inferno. When a burning beam cracked loose above her, Kalen surged forward and caught her by the arm, yanking her out of the way as the wood crashed inches from her feet. They stumbled together, Leora gasping, Kalen pulling her close without thinking. Her eyes widened, startled by the contact, startled that he would risk his skin for hers. He met her gaze through the smoke. "I'm not losing you," he rasped. "Not again." There was no time to absorb the meaning. Another coughing fit echoed deeper inside. Leora broke away, navigating through fallen linen racks and collapsing shelves. She found a group of workers huddled behind an overturned table, trying to avoid the worst of the flames. Her mother lay among them, barely conscious, her breaths shallow and uneven. "Mama!" Leora cried, falling beside her. She pressed her forehead to her mother's, tears mixing with smoke. "Mama, stay awake, please." Kalen dropped to his knees beside them. The heat was unbearable, sweat sliding down his temples, smoke clawing at his throat. But he looked at her mother, then at Leora, and found strength he didn't know he had. "We need to get them out," he said. "Now." The ceiling groaned again. A section of plaster fell, grazing Kalen's shoulder. Pain shot down his arm, but he kept his focus on Leora. Her hands were trembling as she tried to lift her mother. He touched her wrist gently. "Let me." Together, they hoisted her mother into Kalen's arms. She was feather light, frighteningly so. Leora steadied him while he adjusted his grip. Workers clung to each other as they followed, coughing violently, voices hoarse. Through the smoke, the exit looked impossibly far. The flames surged behind them, chasing them down the corridor. Kalen stumbled once, knees buckling under the weight and heat, but Leora caught his arm this time, mirroring the moment she had once dragged him through the storm. "Keep going," she urged. "You can do this." Her belief pushed him forward, step by step, breath by burning breath. As they neared the doorway, the corridor's support beam snapped above them with a piercing crack. Kalen looked up just as a blazing piece of timber fell toward Leora. Instinct overtook pain. He pivoted, shielding her with his body. The beam slammed against his back, knocking him to one knee, but he didn't let her mother slip. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself upright as Leora scrambled to help lift the beam off his shoulder. "Kalen, go!" she cried. "You're hurt." "I'm not leaving you," he growled, smoke shredding his voice. With one final push, they burst into the open air. Cool wind hit their faces, sharp and glorious. Guards rushed toward them, pulling workers away, helping Kalen lower Leora's mother onto a stretcher. Kalen collapsed to his hands, coughing violently, soot covering his skin like war paint. Leora knelt beside him, one hand hovering near his arm but not quite touching, almost afraid to cross a line he'd never let her near before. He lifted his gaze to her, eyes bloodshot, breath unsteady. She looked at him the way she had in the hut, except this time he wasn't a wounded prince. He was just a man who had chosen her safety over his own. Everyone stared, nobles, guards, servants, silent as they watched the prince who once mocked a maid risk his life to save her. Rumors would ignite from this moment like sparks carried by the wind. Kalen tried to speak, but dizziness pulled at the edges of his vision. Leora reached for him instinctively, steadying his shoulder. "You shouldn't have gone inside," she whispered. "Yes," he murmured, coughing. "I should have." Before she could reply, medics hurried between them, lifting him onto a stretcher despite his weak protest. Leora watched as they carried him away, her heart caught somewhere between gratitude and confusion. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the echo of his words. He wasn't leaving her. Not this time. And as Kalen drifted into exhausted semi-consciousness, one truth remained clear in his mind. He could no longer hide from what he'd done, or from the girl whose courage had reshaped his world. Kalen woke to the soft rhythm of rain tapping against the clinic windows, a sound far gentler than the roar of flames that had chased him into unconsciousness. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the heavy throb in his back and the rasp in his lungs. But beneath the pain sat something far heavier, an urgency that pulled at him the moment his mind cleared. He lifted his head and whispered almost to himself, "Where is she?" A nurse stepped closer. "Do you mean Lady Leora?" He flinched at the title. She wasn't a lady, at least not in the way nobles meant it. She was something far rarer. "Yes," he said. "Please, bring her." The nurse hesitated, surprised by the softness in his voice, but she nodded and slipped out of the room. And suddenly, Kalen felt every second stretch, long and unforgiving. He rehearsed words that dissolved on his tongue, wiped his palms against the blanket though they were already dry, tried to steady a heartbeat that refused to listen. When the door finally opened, he forgot every sentence he had practiced. Leora stepped inside slowly, almost cautiously, as though unsure if she was welcome. Her hair was pulled back loosely, her clothes still carrying faint traces of smoke from the fire. Her mother rested safely in another room. Kalen had already ensured she received the best treatment, but Leora's eyes held a weariness deeper than exhaustion. They held the memory of every wound he had dealt her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Kalen shifted upright, wincing, but refusing to lie down while she stood. Leora's gaze flicked to his injuries, concern flickering there before she forced her expression back into something neutral. He opened his mouth, but she beat him to it with a soft, steady question. "Why did you go in after me?" He swallowed, caught between truth and fear. Because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." Her breath shivered just slightly, the smallest crack in an otherwise careful exterior. Kalen reached for the edge of the blanket, gripping it to anchor himself. "Leora," he whispered, "I owe you more than my life. Twice now, you've saved me." She stepped closer, her voice fragile but firm. "You didn't owe me anything. I helped you because it was right. I went into the fire because my mother needed me." He nodded. "I know. And I followed you because, for the first time, I wanted to be someone worthy of what you did." Leora looked down, her fingers twisting together, a habit she seemed unaware of. "Words are easy for princes." "Not these," Kalen said softly. He took a slow breath. "Leora, the things I said to you in the hut, I hear them every night. They echo louder than the fire, louder than the crash, louder than my own shame. I mocked the person who saved me. I pushed away the only hands that cared whether I lived or died." His voice trembled. "I was cruel because I was afraid of needing someone who didn't need anything from me, afraid of seeing how empty I was." Her eyes lifted, meeting his fully for the first time since the fire. There was hurt there, still sharp, but beneath it something searching, something hopeful and afraid of being hopeful. Kalen forced himself to continue. "When I woke up in the hut, I saw the dirt on your clothes before I saw the strength in your arms. I saw your accent before I saw your courage. I judged you by everything that means nothing, and I missed everything that means everything." A tear slid down Leora's cheek before she could stop it. She turned slightly, wiping it away quickly as if ashamed to reveal how deep the wound still ran. "You made me feel small," she murmured. "Smaller than I've ever felt." "I know," he said, voice breaking. "And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel that way again. Not because I owe you, but because it's who I want to be." The rain outside softened into a steady hum, like the world itself was leaning closer to listen. Leora exhaled slowly, her shoulders loosening just a little. She moved to sit in the chair beside him, her gaze fixed on her hands. "Do you mean that, Kaylin? Truly?" He reached out, stopping inches from her fingers, waiting for permission he had once taken for granted. "I do. More than anything I've ever said." She let her hand rest near his, not touching, but close enough that warmth crossed the small distance between them. "I don't know if I can forget it," she whispered, "but I can see that you're trying." He nodded. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm grateful you're even considering it." Leora let out a shaky laugh, quiet, disbelieving, but real. "You speak differently now." "Because I finally understand something," he replied. "Power is useless if it can't lift someone else, and I want to lift you, Leora. Not as a prince, as a man trying to rebuild what he broke." She looked at him for a long time, taking in the sincerity in his trembling hands, the rawness in his voice, the humility glowing through cracks in a pride he no longer clung to. "You've changed," she said softly. "No," he corrected. "You changed me." Silence settled between them, gentle this time, not heavy. A silence filled with possibility instead of pain. Kaylin eased back against the pillows, relief softening his features. Leora finally let her fingers brush lightly against his hand, and the contact sent a quiet warmth through both of them. They stayed like that for a while, speaking in low tones about her mother's condition, about the workers they rescued, about the fire that had nearly taken them both. Their words shifted slowly, from guilt to gratitude, from regret to something tender neither dared to name yet. And when the nurse eventually peeked in to check on them, she paused at the doorway, sensing something delicate forming in the quiet space between the prince and the girl he once belittled. Leora stood to leave, promising to return the next day. But before she stepped through the door, Kaylin called her name. Not urgently, just softly. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me another chance." She held his gaze, offering a small, trembling smile. "Don't waste it." Then she slipped into the hallway, leaving Kaylin with a heart lighter than it had been in years, and with the unmistakable feeling that her forgiveness wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of something far more fragile and far more precious. They say real change happens slowly, so quietly that you barely notice it, until one day you look back and realize the world is no longer the same. For Prince Kaylin, that moment came months after the fire, when the palace courtyard filled with villagers gathered for the unveiling of his new rural aid initiative. Of all the speeches he had given in his life, this one felt different. There was no arrogance in his posture, no distance in his tone. He spoke with a gentleness that once would have embarrassed him, and though he never said her name, everyone knew the truth behind his words. Everyone knew the story of the girl who had carried him through mud and fear and darkness, who had changed the course of a prince simply by refusing to let him die. Leora watched from the side of the courtyard, her hands folded around a leather-bound book of herbal studies. Palace physicians had taken her under their wing, astonished by her instinctive skill. She still blushed when they praised her, still lowered her head when they called her gifted, but there was a quiet confidence building beneath her humility, like a flame that finally had room to breathe. Her mother stood beside her, healthier than she'd been in years, eyes shining with pride every time she looked at her daughter. Kaylin stepped down from the stage, slipping through the crowd until he found her. The noise around them softened, as if the world instinctively gave them space. Leora lifted her gaze, and he gave her the smallest smile, one meant only for her. "You weren't supposed to stand back here," he murmured. "I preferred the shade," she replied, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Besides, you didn't need me on the stage." He shook his head lightly. "I needed you everywhere." His voice carried no grandness, only truth. She felt her breath catch at the sincerity woven through those simple words. They walked together through the gardens, away from the crowds and noise, following the winding stone path lined with blooming lilies. This garden had once been reserved only for nobles, but Kaelin had opened it to the palace staff after the fire. He claimed it was so everyone could find a little peace here. But Leora suspected it was because this was the one place he'd begun to understand humility. They paused near the fountain, where sunlight scattered across the water like broken glass. Leora traced her fingers along the cool stone edge, listening to the rhythm of falling droplets. "Your speech was beautiful," she said softly. "It wasn't enough," he replied. "Nothing I do will ever measure up to what you gave me." She glanced at him, half smiling. "I didn't give you anything except a second chance." "And that," he said quietly, "was everything." He took a slow breath, his eyes warm but weighted with memory. "Leora, the day you dragged me out of that bush, I thought you were just a girl who got in my way. But that was the day I was born again, the day I saw what I could be if I stopped hiding behind a crown." Her heart tightened, not in pain, but in something deep and wordless. She had carried his insults longer than she wanted to admit. Yet now, looking at him, she understood something important. The boy who mocked her in that hut had not survived the fire. The man beside her was someone new, someone she had helped shape without meaning to. "Kaelin," she whispered, "you changed too, not just for me, but for yourself." He lowered his head slightly, almost shy, something she never imagined seeing from him. "I want to walk forward differently," he said, "but I don't want to walk alone." The breeze carried his words between them, delicate enough to break if she wasn't careful. Leora looked at her hands, at the faint scars on her palms from that terrible stormy night. She had grown from those scars. So had he. Slowly, she reached out, letting her fingers rest lightly against his. "I never asked you to walk alone," she said. "You chose that. But if you're choosing something else now—" Her voice softened. "I'm here." Kaelin swallowed, visibly moved. He didn't pull her closer, didn't rush forward. He simply held her hand as though it was the most fragile, precious thing he'd ever been trusted with. They stood like that for a long moment, the garden quiet around them, the world finally settling into something gentle. Leora glanced toward the open sky. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said. "How fate works." "Strange," Kaelin echoed, "and miraculous." She laughed softly, and he felt the sound settle warm in his chest. Months ago she had carried him through darkness. Today he felt as though she was leading him toward light. Together they walked further down the garden path, not as prince and maid, not as savior and saved, but as two people forever marked by a night neither of them would ever forget. And though no one knew where their story would go next, anyone who saw them that day understood one thing clearly. The girl who once lived in the shadows had taught a prince how to be human, and in doing so, she had rewritten both of their destinies.